Hello and welcome to The Daily with me, Niall Paterson. Today on the show, I'll be speaking to someone that I'm sure you will recognise, both from his appearances on the podcast, but also, of course, for the work he does for the Sky News channel. He has, over the past year, covered a range of subjects as diverse as the cost of living crisis, the tanking of the pound, the gilt yields, the fantastic and wonderful world of mass production of tomatoes. But at the same time, he has also found the opportunity to write himself a book. The book is entitled Material World, a substantial story of our past and future. And our guest is, of course, our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. Material World. Explain the conceit of this book, because you take essentially six materials and do what with them?
Exactly. So obviously it's the Madonna song, Material World.
That one had passed me by completely.
We're living in a material world, and yeah, this basically the idea was to kind of have a slightly bottom up view of the world in the way it fits together. And I've chosen 6 substances. You've got sand, you've got salt, you've got oil, you've got lithium, you've got copper, you've got iron. But between those substances, it's not an exhaustive list, of course. So many of the different parts of the world that we rely on, that we touch every day, that's where they come from. And when we think about, the universe that we inhabit, some of the time we kind of think about the processes that make the phone that you might be listening to this on, or indeed the kind of the different, your earphones or whatever it is. You think a little bit about that stuff. But what about where it starts in the ground? So, a lot of people think about silicon chips. Where did that actually begin its life? What did we literally tear out of the ground, and what did we do to it in order to create a silicon chip? And
you use that as an example, tell me.
Yeah, because it turned out there's lots of books about semiconductors, lots of them very good, but they mostly just focus on one bit at the very end, where you already have your silicon, you're scratching, or there's something called photolithography, you're etching different transistors onto them. It's a really complex process. It's amazing. It is nanotechnology. You are literally shifting atoms in order to create these devices we are using every day, and, kind of moaning at the fact they're not loading fast enough. There's nanotechnology going on in there. There's nanotechnology going on in the devices that you're listening to this on. So that's amazing. But equally amazing, it turns out, is the fact that that's only part of the story. That's only the tip of the iceberg.
But explain the utility in me, a smartphone owner, understanding all of that. Why do I need to know how the materials that produced the semiconductors in my phone actually work?
I think we would have more respect for the items that we're using on a daily basis, and perhaps have a slightly less disposable society if we knew a bit more about what went into making them. By disconnecting ourselves from that process, and we have just disconnected ourselves, partly because we don't make as much of this stuff in this country in particular as we used to, partly because you need fewer people to make things, to get stuff out of the ground, to turn it into the products we need. And part of this, the point of this journey I've been on, is trying to find out for myself, what did it take to make the batteries that we're using in our electric cars? Where did that stuff come out of the ground? What did we do to it to turn it into a product? And the answer, it turns out, is so many different pieces of work. So much energy goes into converting these things. We emit so much carbon just to make stuff. And I feel like in a lot of the debate that we talk about, when people are talking about climate change, they're talking about carbon emissions, all of these things, this is quite a new prism through which to see it, because you're seeing that even simple things take a lot of energy and a lot of carbon emissions to make. And so we need to think about that as well.
It is environmental concerns. It is this push to net zero. And there is an awful lot in here that I think would suggest to many people that net zero is going to be awfully, awfully difficult to get towards.
It's going to be it's certainly tougher than I expected it would be, having started and, looked into this. And it is an enormous goal. And I don't think, when we signed up to it and set it into law, when Theresa May signed it into law just before she left as Prime Minister, I don't know if she, indeed the Cabinet, indeed many people out there in the general public were aware of just quite how far-reaching this would be as a goal. It is a noble and honourable goal, but we also have to be kind of honest about the extent to which it's going to be incredibly hard. And why is it going to be hard? It's going to be hard because if you think about this world that we inhabit with all the products, whether it's smartphones, whether it's simple stuff, whether it's plastics, whether it's the house that you live in, the steel that holds it up, the copper wires that come in there, all of this stuff is basically the bedrock of our lives, of modern civilization, because without a lot of that stuff, we're in big trouble. All of it took carbon emissions to make. All of it. All of it. There are no exceptions. And in order to get to net zero, it is not just about building lots of wind turbines, although that is a big part of it. It is about going through all of these different processes that constitute, the fruit of centuries of research, of scientific endeavor, of manufacturing, and reimagining them. We have to redo the Industrial Revolution, or the various industrial revolutions that have already happened, all over again. And that is massive. It's also exciting because there's opportunities aplenty there. But it's just the scale of it, I think, isn't as, enormously understood.
You've got to be pretty anti-environment to push for all the materials that you need to turn us into a net zero zero economy.
You need more copper. You need more lithium.
You need to be quite blasé about the mining, don't you?
Well,
and you've been there.
It's this is the paradox, and this is the most uncomfortable thing. But there is no plausible route to eliminating carbon emissions while also keeping everyone in the world in the standard of living that they all expect, without having to do a lot more exploitation of the earth. And you just won't do it if you don't do that. And that's not kind of being defeatist. That's just saying, if you want batteries, you've got to get the lithium from somewhere. You've got to get the cobalt from somewhere as well, the nickel, the manganese, all the other things. If you want wind turbines, you need a lot of steel. And right now, we don't have a particularly good way of mass producing steel. We don't have a good way at all of mass producing steel without a lot of carbon emissions. You've got to, make fiberglass that goes into the wind turbine cells. Well, you've got to make the glass. And right now, what do we make glass with? We make glass with big furnaces that are mostly powered by natural gas. And there are all of these paradoxes. Net zero is doable. It's just hard.
I have to admit that the environmental stuff, the climate change stuff, is absolutely fascinating to me, and it's stuff we have indeed covered on other podcasts. But what was also something of a revelation to me is when you start talking about the great game that is now taking place between the superpowers and indeed between lesser powers for control of these resources.
Yeah, it's happening now, and there is one country which is particularly leading the charge, which is China.
Yeah,
they are aware that around the world our focus is shifting from petro economies. When you look at the story of the 20th century, that a lot of it was defined by where the oil was. That was it, including, for that matter, and there's a long bit about this, including, in the Second World War, it was kind of a war about oil and who controlled the oil. And part of the reason Hitler struggled was, alongside tactical decisions, was that he didn't have enough oil. So China now is very conscious of that and has been pushing for access to this other suite of materials. So whereas in the past it was very much about oil, it was very much about coal, now, it's copper, it's lithium, it's cobalt, it's all of these materials. China is trying to take possession, trying to own a lot of these mines. It is doing a lot of the refining of the materials. So people talk about how it's striking how much China dominates the market for things like rare earth materials. So it's massively important. And right now what's happening, in Taiwan, right now what's happening with like the noises between the US and the UK and China, it is getting more and more bellicose. So we are making those noises. We are making it more difficult potentially to trade with the place from where we're we're reliant on it for the stuff that we need to get to net zero. So there's a paradox. There's a lot of paradoxes.
But you can flip it on its head. I mean, China is relying on the money that gets sent to it to buy the resources.
Completely.
I mean, it is this curious aspect of geopolitics to me that you've got, as you say, this rather bellicose language, the butting of heads that's going on in diplomatic channels. But all of these countries are so closely linked to each other by these resources. I mean, we talked, I think, in the past about Somaliland. There was a famine in Somaliland because they couldn't get access to grain because the grain was stored in silos in Ukraine and wasn't getting out of the country. This interconnectivity is remarkable.
Yeah, and it's all and it's a greater interconnectivity than one even thinks, because fertilizer as well. In Somaliland and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, around the world as well. You need fertilizer, and fertilizer ultimately has to come from somewhere. And a lot of that fertilizer also comes from Russia, Ukraine, places like that. A lot of fertilizer, by the way, and this is another one of the kind of striking things I hadn't quite appreciated until I did this research, is that, half of the world population would not be here, would not be alive, were it not for the fertilizer that we make, nitrogen-based fertilizer. So our bodies are literally in part artificially fixed through nitrogen, from nitrogen from the air, and turned into fertilizer, which goes into the food or indeed goes into the kind of feed stuff for livestock, which we then eat. We are all literally made of this stuff. What is fertilizer made from? It's made from natural gas. We use natural gas to make the fertilizer. And so, again, we're in this knotty, awkward situation where the thing that is very unfashionable right now turns out to be pretty important for the survival of humanity. It's not just about burning it in order to turn turbines which can create power, or indeed to get your car going. It is feeding us. And that the upshot of that is that you start to see the world in a slightly different prism. It's not black and white. It's this enormous grey area. And I think, frankly, a lot of people, I hope, listening will realise that, of course, that's the way the world is. But a lot of the stuff has been presented, including, dare I say, in some of the media, as black and white.
Yeah.
Heroes and villains. Here are the bad guys. Here are the good guys. And it's not like that. It really isn't. And when you kind of strip all that stuff away and just look at these materials, look at the products, look at our lives, then you kind of see it's much more complicated and much more interesting than that.
But at the end of writing this book, just as a cheeky question, did you have more or less respect for organisations like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion?
Oh, well, that's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it?
It is a little, sorry. But you understand why I'm asking.
No,
because,
I do.
Because as you say, heroes and villains is very much the theme of the day when it comes to environmental issues.
But there's a really sensible point that Just Stop Oil, that's at the core of what Just Stop Oil are talking about, which is saying that, right now, maybe we'll be able to make it to net zero without having to license new oil fields. So we can kind of make do with the oil fields we've got. That's not unreasonable. In fact, that is the International Energy Agency's plan. They say that's possible. And the International Energy Agency is a representative of lots of oil producers and consumers in the West. It is by no means an environmental movement. When I see some of the protests, is the tenor of, and I understand why people have to communicate like this, but the tenor of, we are all about to, we're all going to hell, we're all going to die. If we don't do this, millions will die. There's very little evidence for that. And there's very little evidence for utter catastrophism. There is plenty of evidence that things are not going to be great and we need to do something about it. But it's that kind of difference between saying, we need to really sort this out because it's going to be bad. And for some people, it could indeed be very bad. And you need to kind of find ways of making their lives kind of manageable, and saying, we are facing apocalyptic catastrophe, because we're not. And by the same token, we need also just to be clear-eyed about the positive sides.
Sure.
We can't eat without the stuff.
How then is the United Kingdom performing in its desire to be more environmentally friendly? Look, you're an economics geek, I'm a political geek, and I've heard governments since before David Cameron was hugging Huskies talking about their green credentials, and yet, where are we in terms of the renewable sector? Where are we in terms of battery production? Where are we in pursuit of net zero?
We know the answer to this, which is we're not doing very well.
No.
We're not doing very well in this country.
And is that because we don't have the materials here to take advantage of in the way that America, kind of Central and South America, Asia have?
I mean, there's a bit of that, yeah. Right now, actually, one of the most consequential things that's happened in the past kind of, 10, 20 years is the fact that the US discovered how to get oil and gas out of shale rocks, because it means they have pretty cheap oil and pretty cheap gas. Whereas here in the UK, we had the North Sea. It's not exhausted by any means, but
No.
Its best days are now behind it. During that period, I think the critical thing is during that period when we were benefiting from lots, from a net surplus in oil and gas production, we were actually deindustrializing our economy rather than kind of making the most of it. Our economy was becoming more reliant on things like financial services, on other kind of ancillary services, on tech. These are not by any means kind of the wrong sectors. This is not stuff that we shouldn't be doing, but we just really allowed our entire kind of industrial sector to wither away. All the dirty stuff, all the grimy stuff, all the carbon intensive stuff, we allowed that to go off to China. We charged really high energy prices to producers, so it just became unattractive for them to be in the UK. So they pushed it off to China and other places. And the upshot is, we have one of the lowest. Our carbon emissions have fallen faster than pretty much anyone else out there in the developed world. It is a massive success story in terms of just looking at carbon emissions. But then you look at the bigger picture of the UK economy, and we've deindustrialized lots of, when we talk about those areas of the country that have been hollowed out, when we talk about the left behind, when we talk about, levelling up and all of that stuff, these areas have been left behind, and it is really difficult.
What single story would you pick out of this as the greatest revelation, the greatest eye-opener that you had in your travels?
I mean, there was a moment where there's quite a lot of stuff. It's quite tricky. But there was a moment where I was kind of standing on the lip of this mine in Chile. It is the deepest man-made hole in the world. It's like when looking down, it's like looking down into the Grand Canyon, except that we made this, we dug it. It's more than 100 years old. It's called Chuquicamata. And the knowledge that in order to satisfy our demand for more copper in the future, we would need not just one of these, but 3 of those mines, new Grand Canyon-style mines, every year to satisfy the demand for electric cars, for wind turbines, for everything else, solar panels. And when you stare at these things, you think to yourself, there's no way we're going to do that. And that brings you to this issue. Do we realize the scale of the challenge that we're facing in the coming years, leaving aside all the geopolitical difficulty that we might well be facing? Do we know just how kind of serious thing we're heading for? And I think the answer is probably no, because there are too few people thinking about the world in terms of its materials, in terms of where stuff comes from, in terms of the pragmatic reality, rather than, ideological battles in Westminster and thereafter.
Well, look, the book Material World, A Substantial Story of Our Past and Future is out now, Ed?
Out now.
And that is your lot for the Daily for today. My thanks, of course, to Ed Conway for coming into the studio. This edition was produced by Soila Aparicio. Our editor is Paul Stanworth.